Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Drew, for that intro, and thanks to the park for having us. I'm not going to hide behind there. I'll just stand here. So I want you all to imagine you're off the coast of Anacapa. You're diving in the water there. It's a little bit murky because that's the way the water is in this area, thanks to all the plankton that it has. So productive. There's so much life. Also means it's a little bit murky. You're about 30 feet down, and then you see this giant gray animal start to approach you, and then your heart skips a beat because you think like, oh, is this a great white shark? And then you realize it's this gentle giant the size of a smart car that has come to check you out because it's really interested in your bubbles, and it's just kind of curious. So that's what we're going to talk about today, the giant sea bass. The giant sea bass is a large coastal fish. They're found, they can grow up to 500 pounds and about 6 feet long, almost as big as they are long. They live an extremely long time. They can live up more than 70 years. Yeah. And this, 70 years. And this large fish is the largest teleost carnivore in our kelp forest. Teleost means bony fish. So it's the largest bony fish carnivore. It's a top predator because the largest overall fish carnivore is the great white shark. This fish, its entire range extends from Humboldt Bay in Northern California down to Baja California in Mexico. In California, we tend to find it from San Diego up to just south of Point Conception, which is a few miles north of where we are right now. Giant sea bass has the unfortunate reality of being delicious. For this reason, it has been fished for more than a century. Commercial fishing for giant sea bass began in the 1870s. And because of this, the fishery didn't do so well. So you can see on this graph, it has millions of pounds landed. When we talk about fisheries, landed means literally a fisher went out, caught it, and then came back to land with it. So this is millions of pounds landed or caught of giant sea bass with years on the x-axis. And you can see that this fishery peaked right about 1932. Then it kind of went up and down, and then right around 1970s, the fishery totally crashed. And because this fishery crashed, the state put a moratorium on the targeted fishing of giant sea bass. So commercial and recreational fishers were no longer allowed to go out and try to catch giant sea bass. Except there was a kind of caveat to that, that if a commercial fisher that was trying to catch California halibut or white sea bass in the gill or trammel net fishery and accidentally or incidentally caught a giant sea bass in their net, were allowed to retain 2 of these fish and land them back at the port and sell them. In 1988, this was amended so that only 1 incidentally caught giant sea bass could actually be retained and sold, only in those fisheries. And that's how the law stands today. That is still happening today. Fishers that are incidentally caught this fish in those fisheries are still able to land it, which is why you can still see local black sea bass or giant sea bass in fish markets. So this means that this isn't a complete bycatch nuisance. This fish still brings some money to fisheries. And then in 1996, this fish was categorized as critically endangered by the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And since we're talking about this fish being on the market, just a really random tangent because we did it, and so why not talk about it? If you guys eat fish, you've heard that some fish tend to have higher mercury concentrations than others, especially fish that are high on the food web like tuna or billfish. So we were curious about whether this actually held for giant sea bass because they are a top predator in the kelp forest. So we went out and collected samples from fish markets that were labeled as giant sea bass or black sea bass, and then did some genetic testing to verify that they were indeed black sea bass or giant sea bass. And they all were, which is solid points for California and seafood labeling. So once we verified that, we actually tested them for mercury. And we found that of the 17 samples, 70% of those were above the action level set by the EPA for mercury concentrations, and 30% were above the action level set for the FDA. So just, leaving you with that information regarding mercury and giant sea bass. But back to the actual, there we go, fishery. So it looks a little depressing, but current research, or kind of research in the past decades, suggests that there could be a potential recovery. So here we have, it's a little bit blurry, but we have what's called CPUE, and you'll see this acronym again. CPUE means catch per unit effort. It's just saying for, say you standardize over 5 days of fishing, how many fish are you catching if you're only going out fishing for 5 days? And if you see that start to increase, then that might tell you that maybe there's more fish in the ocean, because for the same amount of fishing, you're catching more fish. So we've seen that catch per unit effort increase over time for giant sea bass, which suggests that maybe that moratorium on fishing is working. In 1994, California banned the use of inshore gill nets, so having gill nets close to shore. So maybe that's working as well. But we still don't know, even if this population is recovering, we don't know if this comes anywhere near close what the pre-exploitation levels were. But it looks a little bit hopeful. And in addition to this fish being important for fisheries or a value to fisheries, this is also an icon of the California kelp forest to recreational divers. These fish are big, they're really bold, and they're really curious, and they love going up to divers to check them out. And they're the equivalent of going to Yellowstone National Park and seeing a bison. These fish are really great to see underwater. So considering that these fish are worth something, they're of value to both divers and fishers, how do we actually go about thinking, how much is a species actually worth? There's a couple different ways that we tend to think about the economic value of a species. The main one we think about is the consumptive use value. This is something like, how much is it worth in the market? When you're actually harvesting, this can be something as a fish market, or when you're harvesting an animal for its fur, or anything that actually involves the consumption of that animal. We have the non-consumptive use value, where you're still interacting with this animal, but you're not in any way harvesting it. So this is something like wildlife viewing, wildlife photography, whale watching. You're still kind of using that animal, even though you're not actually harvesting it. And then we have the non-use value, which is the value that you place on this animal even if you never get to see it. You're just happy it exists and you value its existence even though you will never interact with an animal. So for this work, I focused exclusively on the consumptive use value and the non-consumptive use value. And I was looking at what is the annual economic value of giant sea bass to commercial fisheries, so that consumptive use value, and to recreational divers as a wildlife viewing experience, so a non-consumptive use value. So what I did here is I first had to calculate the value to fishers, then I'll tell you how I calculated the value to divers, and just think about what this could mean. There we go. So to calculate the value to fishers, I use what are called landing receipts. So every time a fisher goes out to sea to go fishing and then comes back, they have a little slip of paper that they fill out, and it says what species they caught, how much of each species, how much they sold it for, and a self-reported location on where they caught these fish. So I worked with California Department of Fish and Wildlife and obtained landing receipts for every single fishing trip that occurred between 2006 and 2015 for commercial fisheries. Of those, I looked only at the ones that had the gill and trammel net fisheries, because those are the only two fisheries in which if a giant sea bass is incidentally caught, it's legally allowed to be landed, so it's the only one where they would actually be reported. And for these, because they had the landing price for each fish, and it's each fish, I say each fish, not just each poundage of giant sea bass, because each landing receipt corresponds to one trip, for one fishing trip. And because they can only land one giant sea bass per fishing trip, then each receipt corresponds to a single giant sea bass. I found that the average annual gross landing value, so the average annual value directly to the commercial fishers that are catching these fish and then selling them in the port, is about $12,600, give or take a couple thousand on average across this decade. This is about less than 1% of the overall value of the actual target fishery of white sea bass or California halibut, which are both sustainable seafood options. This is only about 1% of the total value of that target fishery. And this corresponds to about an average of 97 giant sea bass being landed per year, which might not seem like a lot. It might to you. 97, I mean, what does that mean? Well, some recent studies suggest that the local population might not be that big, again, because we saw that fishery declined pretty drastically. So these 97 fish could be anywhere between 2 to 19% of the total Southern California population. And And because of these landing receipts also give you a self-reported catch location, we can actually look at where these fish are getting caught the most. And so, for example, out here, east of Anacapa Island, there appears to be some big hotspot of catch. Or sorry, not San Nicolas Island, not Anacapa Island. Or the Cortes Tanner Banks, or the backside of Santa Cruz appears to be having some more catch. So you can start to look at, okay, where is this catch occurring the most? Where can we try to work? If we think that it might be too much catch, where can we try to actually figure out how to manage this issue? And it also tells you when these fish are getting caught. So it's not all year round that you're getting the most catch. Seems like most of this bycatch is happening right around July or August. So we have this value of $12,600 to commercial fishers. So let's figure out what's the value to divers. So I thought exclusively or worked exclusively with charter boat divers. These are divers that are paying for a passage, a ticket on a boat, and then getting on this boat and going, it takes them diving somewhere and they go diving there. The reason I chose charter boat divers as opposed to divers that dive from their own boat or from shore is that charter boat divers are dealing with money more regularly. I mean, everyone's dealing with money because you have to buy gas for your boat or buy your gear. But these divers, on the day that they're diving, are dealing with a transaction. So in order to figure out what the annual value of giant sea bass is to charter boat divers, I first had to figure out how many diver days per year were occurring south of Point Conception in this core range of giant sea bass, or how many dives were happening. And what economic value do divers actually place on giant sea bass? So first, let's talk about estimating how many diver days were happening. I first compiled a list of all the charter dive boats that occur in this range of giant sea bass in 2015, and that year that was 41 dive boats. I had to figure out the number of diver days per year for every single boat. So for that, I had to figure out about the average number of trips that each boat did per year and the average number of divers that they had on each trip, their average capacity. So in order to do this, I surveyed a subset of these vessels, about 17 of them, of different size ranges, and just asked the captains, asked the charter boat owners, what the answers to these questions were, how often they went out, how many days, what capacity they had, and then I extrapolated that out to the rest of the dive boats. I'm happy to talk more about that if anyone's curious. But the estimate was that there was about 64,399 charter boat diver days. So diver days means, if you have 17 divers on a boat in one day, that's 17 diver days in this area south of Point Conception. So what economic value do these charter boat divers place on giant sea bass? Well, I did what's called a contingent valuation, which is a very fancy way of saying I asked people what they value something for. What is this worth to you? So I, in this survey, also compiled a diver profile. So I asked divers what their dive experience was, what their kind of diving behavior was, and what their dive-related spending was. And then I elicited what's called a willingness to pay. So willingness to pay is, I asked them, how much more would you be willing to pay, in addition to what you typically pay for your normal charter boat dive, for a guaranteed giant sea bass sighting? Obviously, we can never guarantee a giant sea bass sighting, but I wasn't trying to place a value on a potential ecotourism industry where that's what you're paying for, you're paying for a potential sighting. I was trying to get a value of the actual animal, of actually interacting with that animal, which is why it's guaranteed sighting. I interviewed a total of 265 divers. 84% of them listed recreation as their top reason for diving. And 92% of them listed California as their main dive location. Of these divers, when I asked them what the importance of seeing a giant sea bass on a dive was on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 not being important at all and 5 being very important, more than half of them listed this as a 4 or 5. 75% of the divers had actually seen a giant sea bass before, and 99 at least had heard of a giant sea bass. And then when I asked about this willingness to pay that I mentioned, how much they were willing to pay for a guaranteed giant sea bass sighting, the answers were pretty much across the board, widespread from $0 to more than $150. The average, or the mean, was about $42.81, but it was such a random distribution, although the important part is that more than 80% of the respondents were willing to pay something to have a guaranteed giant sea bass sighting. But instead of applying that mean to those diver days, because it was so distributed or so spread out, I instead superimposed those diver days onto this distribution and aggregated all that number. And this gave me that the non-consumptive use value of giant sea bass to divers is $2.3 million. I also calculated a more conservative estimate, can talk to you more about that if you want to know, of about $1.6 million. But we have these two values, $12,600 to commercial fisheries and $2.3 million to recreational divers. This is a difference in more than 2 orders of magnitude. Of course, this doesn't really account for the higher market chain prices of the fishery sector or the operational costs for both the chartered dive boats or the fishing boats, but it does give you an idea of the 2 different values and the drastic difference that there is between these 2. So what does this actually mean for giant sea bass? This non-consumptive use value is not money going into anyone's pocket. This is not money that you're gonna make because this fish is out there, but rather it just shows you, it's a way to quantify what a diver preference is for giant sea bass. It sheds light on this other stakeholder that has interest in this resource. And fishing and viewing are not mutually exclusive. But rather, you can now include this in management models and figure out, well, what are certain areas, using those maps that you can create, using those self-reported catch locations, where are areas where maybe you're not catching that much of that target fishery, but a lot of giant sea bass? Maybe that could be a giant sea bass viewing sanctuary, because there's a lot of ecotourism potential in that. As Drew mentioned, I worked in the Great Barrier Reef. They have a place called Cod Hole. It's called Cod Hole because it has a bunch of potato cods, fish that are very similar, that fish right there, to the giant sea bass. So you can kind of work these things together where it's not one or the other, you can still have both. And knowing that we have such a excited group of divers along our coastline who just want to get out to see this fish, we can also use their energy and their eagerness to actually learn more about these fish. And with that, I'll pass this on to Francis.
Can everyone hear me okay? Good. Thanks, Anna, for giving us the economic perspective and the perspective on the recreational divers as stakeholders in the management of this species. As Anna mentioned, I'm going to talk about ways as scientists that we can leverage the enthusiasm and interest, not to mention value, that divers put on giant sea bass to learn more about them as a species. This is a strange figure to be showing you, but I thought I'd zoom out a little bit and just get a quick show of hands. How many of you are familiar with the concept of citizen science? As I suspected, okay. Second question, how many of you have participated in a citizen science project? So I think I'm preaching to the choir here and don't really need to convince you of the value of citizen science, not only for engaging society in scientific research and raising awareness about the biology of the natural world, but for collecting data on temporal and spatial scales that would simply be impossible if it were professional researchers working alone. And just as one example, kind of one of the largest citizen science projects in the world, eBird has millions of observations, millions of users, and when you get that much data, it becomes incredibly powerful, and you can create visualizations like this. This is for the California gull specifically, which occurs here in the Channel Islands, and this is plotting relative abundance of the species at on a weekly basis throughout its migration and breeding cycle. So we wanted to create a citizen science project around giant sea bass. And over the past few years, The Macaulay Lab, the Benioff Ocean Initiative, and the Love Lab all at UC Santa Barbara created a web-based citizen science project specifically on giant sea bass. The core of this study is around photos. So thankfully, thanks to companies like GoPro, for example, and just the proliferation of digital cameras overall becoming cheaper and working better, many divers out on dive boats will carry a camera, even if they're not necessarily a serious hobbyist, and snap a few photos to share with their friends, maybe take a video, post to YouTube. And they see giant sea bass, and when they see them, they're very excited to share them. So what this website allows us to do is create a portal for divers acting as citizen scientists to contribute their photos or even video, actually. And they fill out this form, they upload the image, and they give us some information like the date of encounter and the location, as well as any additional comments, like maybe they saw 5 but only got photos of 2 or 1. And each submission represents a sighting of a single fish. Even if you saw 5, those get submitted separately. Maybe you can start to put together the link here, but we're not just collecting sightings and putting them on the map as if each fish were completely anonymous. Photo identification, or photo ID, is a technique that's extremely widespread in wildlife ecology and can be used effectively in species where individuals have unique markings, whether that's the stripes of a Grevy zebra, or in our case, spots on a giant sea bass. Obviously, another example is many cetaceans. I always get a big kick when I'm out on a whale watching boat here in the Santa Barbara Channel, and they can identify a blue whale or a humpback whale by name and know how old it is, where it's been. It's incredible. And our colleagues at the Love Lab at UCSB laid the groundwork for implementing photo identification in giant sea bass in an exploratory study that they just published last year. And they did a few things. They went down to the Aquarium of the Pacific down in Long Beach, and they took photos of the 3 captive giant sea bass there. They did that over a span of 12 to 24 hours. And they took a whole bunch of photos. They also obtained photos taken way back in 2003 when they were relatively recently arrived at the aquarium. And then they attempted to use a pattern matching algorithm called I3S. And they found a few key things that give us confidence in photo identification moving forward. One is that the spot patterns didn't change over time. They didn't change on short time scales, and they also didn't change on long time scales. The other thing that they did was, with a small set of images from about 35 known unique individuals, they marked up the spots like this, and then ran them through the algorithm and tested it out. And they found that the algorithm performed quite effectively as long as the orientation of the fish wasn't too extreme. So you don't want to be taking a head-on photo because the spot pattern is going to be all distorted. The spots in the front are going to be really big. The spots in the back, if you can see them at all, will be all distorted. So this laid the groundwork for us scaling this up rather than on an ad hoc way and incorporate photo ID and computer vision pattern matching into our web application. And this is kind of a fun example. This is a fish at Casino Point on Catalina. And you can see that it's actually marked. I'm not sure if there's a laser pointer, but if you look on the right side of the image, there's this device kind of hanging out of the side of the fish. Sometimes divers think that it's a lure stuck in the side, but it's actually not. It's an acoustic tag that was deployed by researchers at Cal State Long Beach. And it's mildly invasive, but doesn't really disrupt the animal long term. They just take the tag on the end of a sharp pole and jab it right in, and it stays there for a long time. And then what the tag does is it sends out a unique signal. And if you have a receiver nearby, then it'll record every time that it gets a little ping from the tag, and then you know that that specific fish came by. So it's like each fish having its own little unique radio station, for example. And I like this because it illustrates how these techniques can be complementary. So what I'm showing here is the annotations of spots that we use for the pattern matching algorithm. Whoops. So when we receive an image, it's not 100, it's not like we click a button and we get a match immediately. We go in and we click on the spots, takes maybe 30 seconds, and then we run it through 2 computer vision matching algorithms. One is the one that I already mentioned that the Love Lab tested out, and the second one is called the modified growth algorithm. That's growth named after Ed Growth, who's an emeritus professor of physics at Princeton University. So you may have seen on the flyer for this talk that there was computer imaging technique, and I don't want to get too down in the weeds, but it's an interesting enough story that I think it's worth sharing. This algorithm, the original growth algorithm, was developed to match up images taken of stars in the Hubble Space Telescope. And the modified growth algorithm has since been applied for doing photo identification in a variety of species that have spots. And so we wanted to try it out with giant sea bass. A little bit of background on how it works, for those of you who are curious. You save the spot annotations as points, and you forget that the fish is there, and then you just think about the spots as points in an XY plane. Then you create all the potential triangles possible between the points in that pattern. And then you compare those triangles to the triangles formed in each of the patterns in your existing library. And what it does is for each potential match, it compares the properties of those triangles, especially ratios of the lengths of the different sides and internal angles. And a couple other variables, and then what it spits out is for potential matches, it gives you a match score and then a match quality. So let's look at what that actually looks like for a giant sea bass. There's that same photo that I showed you earlier, and a potential match on the right. You can see that this is one match out of 8. Even though we have hundreds of these patterns in our database, it shortened the list down to 8, which is great. I'm only showing the top 3 here. And you can see we got moderate scores for the top 2, which is actually an illustration of the fact that the algorithm is performs in a robust way. And I say that because the angle of the photograph, of the original photograph, wasn't actually ideal. It was taken kind of from above, so there's a bit of distortion. You're seeing the spot patterns on the top half more than you are on the bottom half, and you're not really seeing as close to a flat plane as you otherwise would. Nonetheless, it's matching. The two top results were true matches. The next one down had a low match score, and the percent of triangles matching dropped from 24% in the true matches. So you don't need 100% to match. Even 25% of the triangles matching gives you confidence in a good match. Drop down to just under 13%. And this case is kind of fun because we have the extra assurance of that tag that I showed you earlier. You can see that on the fish on the right hanging off there. Just as another fun example, this was a fish that was originally sighted, again, in this particular case, at Catalina Island in October of 2017. And forgetting about the computer algorithm for a second, let's just try to use our human pattern recognition skills. And can you see kind of a hexagon shape right in the middle of that fish between the spots? I'll just get up here. Formed by these 6 spots. Here's that same fish in September of last year. So it went from October 2017 to September 2017. This is early October of 2018. If you look carefully, you can see that same kind of hexagon shape. And here's one that's actually the same fish. We got 2 sightings of this individual. The other one, you could see the tag. It covered more of the body, but it was kind of distorted. And the pattern matching algorithm actually matched it just with the front half of the fish. We didn't even need the back half. Just the spots on the front were enough to match. So I hope I've convinced you that photo identification is possible, at least some of the time. And if a sighting doesn't match, then we combine it with, then we assign it to a unique individual and start building out our library. So I think one of the first questions that interests all of us is, how many have you found? And we have a nice little dashboard on our website that shows the total number of unique left side patterns and right side patterns, the number of encounters where an identification was possible, and how many citizen scientists have submitted. We're up to 61. It's important to remember that this is an ongoing study, and so these numbers weren't the same last week, and they will be different next month. It's a living database that's continually growing and being curated. But answering that question is actually kind of tricky because we don't always get images of the left side and the right side. Occasionally we get lucky and we'll have both, but other times we only have the left or the right, and we don't know how many of these left side are actually over here, and we just haven't linked them yet. So there's a fair amount of uncertainty there. But I'll show you another way of looking at this question of how many are we seeing, how many might there be here in California waters. And that's a discovery curve approach. This is a method that's often used actually for surveying species richness in very biodiverse places, like say you're counting beetles in the Amazon rainforest, and there's no way that you'll actually find every last one. We're still discovering new species every year, right? So when scientists have tried to estimate the total number of species on the Earth, it's an estimate, right? One way of doing that is looking at how the number of new or unique species increases with survey effort. Now, I want you to change species into individual, and you can see basically how this translates. So this is a figure from a study of Hawaiian monk seals done by NOAA out in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. And what we're seeing on the x-axis is number of survey hours, survey effort hours, and the number of unique marked seals on the y-axis. And you can see at one island, all those each curve is a different year. On one island, after a certain number of hours, it plateaus, it flatlines, and that's pretty much the number of seals that you might expect that there are in that year. Now you look at the curves for another set of islands, French Frigate Shoals, and those curves have not reached an asymptote. They have not plateaued or flatlined, which means that the true species is higher, and you can start to estimate exactly how many there are based on the shape of that curve and try to figure out, okay, based on the way that it's curving, where does it look like it's going to taper off? So what does this look like in our case? Here we have number of individuals, unique individuals on the left, and the number of sightings sightings reported on the bottom, on the x-axis. And you can see it's increasing steadily and also showing no sign of slowing down, which means we got our work cut out for us in terms of cataloging this whole population. It'll be really interesting to see how the shape of this curve changes in the coming years. Okay, so again, this is ongoing research. We're still building the data set, but another question is that we can start to look at is when are we seeing them? This is a plot of all of the encounters. Each bar is a week, and you can see that this pattern of seasonality pretty closely matches what Anna showed you for catches. One interesting tidbit is that in the winter months, when kind of common knowledge and what some of the research has pointed to as giant sea bass not really being present in diveable depths, tends to not quite be true. We do see them, but at much lower rates. And it's important to note that this isn't taking into account potential biases in number of divers in the water and things like that. So very basic questions, right? How many, when, and this is, the next question is where. This is a map that I showed when we were still kind of in beta of the sites where we'd seen them a couple years ago. And this is what the map looks like now. We're over 70 kind of dive sites in Southern California. But zooming out a little bit, we have no idea what's going on down in Mexico. These are a handful of sightings from another citizen science project, iNaturalist. So hopefully in the coming years, we'll start to get sightings from Baja California as well, but not quite yet. Now, let's bring it a little closer to home and talk about Channel Islands National Park. Anacapa is kind of a clear hotspot in our data set. We just have a few sightings around Santa Cruz, which is not surprising since most divers go to Anacapa. But we haven't another interesting site, and that's Santa Barbara Island, where divers have a hard time getting out to nearly as often. But we had kind of a unique opportunity to, like I said, complement another type of scientific study, which is using baited remote underwater video surveys, which is essentially a video camera on an anchor with a little pole with some bait on the end, and you put it down for an hour, and you see what shows up. I think they might have needed to change the bait canister design after this. I'll wait for it. Yeah, both sides, exactly. That fish cooperated very nicely. So we have data from National Marine Sanctuary expeditions that went out in August 2017 and August 2018. So as this project grows and we collect more data, we anticipate getting insights into questions that we hadn't actually originally thought to ask. And one of those that someday, hopefully, we'll be able to get a look at is changes in the biology and life history of this species. So on the left, you see a little juvenile that use completely different habitats. In the middle is a subadult, and on the right is an adult. And we don't have a good picture of the different habitats that they use and how far, for example, an individual fish might move across its lifetime. Another future question that we hadn't really been thinking about was fishery interactions. So as this species recovers, or seems to be recovering, we may see more and more unintentional fishery interactions. This is not in one of the fisheries that Anna was talking about. It's in a recreational fishery. This fisherman definitely did not keep this fish. That would be totally illegal. He put it back, but he sent it to us. And so we may be able to learn more about ways that these fish are interacting with all different kinds of fisheries and hopefully manage them better based on that understanding. We also have some images of fish with hook and line of the big guys dragging hook and line behind them. And a broader question that we hope to answer in the future is how is this species using marine protected areas, and what importance do marine protected areas have for them? In theory, their mortality should be pretty low throughout their range, but they do get caught and they do get captured. So marine protected areas might not necessarily be that important for protecting them from getting caught and harvested, but what about other questions of food? These are big fish. They need to eat. And how might elevated prey levels in marine protected areas be important for them making a living? Getting close to time. I want to make sure we have enough time for questions. But I hope that these two presentations have given you a view of ways that non-traditional economic tools and citizen science approaches can help fill in unknown questions, unknown knowledge gaps for the species and the way that humans interact with it. I'd like to thank all of our supporters and collaborators and funders, especially Channel Islands National Park, been very supportive from the very beginning, from before the Citizen Science Project launched. Thank you all for listening. If you happen to see a giant sea bass, please submit it, and we'll be happy to answer any questions. Good question, and that's something that I should have mentioned. So the question was, how many years has this project been going? So the project itself launched last July, but we've gotten kind of super users who have submitted their entire archives of giant sea bass photos. The oldest one we have actually goes back to 1996. So that fish, for example, might not still be around, but just a couple of years kind of in development, and just since July officially launched.
What age do they start reproducing? And these huge fish, how many offspring can one have? So it's like, I mean, are huge.
Age at reproduction is like a basic biology question, and which is now like super embarrassing that I'm not really sure what to tell you here. Considering this is a very large, long-lived fish, this topic typically, I would guess, about a decade or so would take them to get to sexual maturity where they can start reproducing. These fish are broadcast spawners, so they'll spawn out thousands of eggs. How many actually get, manage to get fertilized by the eggs and the sperm that are on the water, and then how many actually grow into a viable embryo and become little fish that survive, that's a whole different story. But a lot of these fish will just release their gametes into the water. So it's in the thousands, definitely not in the thousands, that become actual little fish that grow up to be these giants that you see here. Well, the marine protected areas for a fish that isn't heavily targeted, it's a different kind of story. Yes, you're probably going to get less bycatch in a marine protected area for sure because there's no fishing at all whatsoever. For the little fish, it's different dynamics dictate mortality. More like, are they getting eaten? Are the conditions of the water right? Is the temperature right? There's a lot more that goes into, is a habitat suitable for what, the habitat that an adult needs is very different than the habitat that a tiny little giant sea bass needs. So you're looking at a whole other different set of conditions.
Wonderful presentations. I have two questions for you, if I may. The first, has your analysis of the mercury content in giant sea bass been published, and widely disseminated? Interesting information.
So the question is, has the analysis on the mercury concentrations been published, and why hasn't it been disseminated? It's been published. It's out there. I can't answer to the second one. I do not work for the FDA. I do not know what to say, but it's out there.
Question, doing a rough calculation in my head, if there are about 65,000 dive trips per year in this area, if you were to say a surcharge of just 20 cents per dive for each diver out there, you could generate enough money to pay the commercial fishermen to not land giant sea bass. Has any consideration been given to doing something like that? As a diver myself, I would gladly pay some type of surcharge to have the commercial fishermen not land what they catch incidentally.
So the question is, considering this, value of the fish, it's not super high to commercial fishermen. If you were to add this incremental charge to divers of about 25 cents, this would more than make up for the price for the fishermen to not land this fish. And has anything been done along those lines? Well, the issue is that these fish are you have to look at it more on like a broader scale of management, because it's not necessarily, it could, if the fish are going to get caught in the net regardless, then you want a fisher to be able to make money off of it if you have a fish in the net. If, depending on, is it dead, is it alive, you don't necessarily want it to go to waste. It's a fish that can be eaten, and if, depending on what the population status is, that might be okay. We need to get more estimates on what the population status is for these fish, because perhaps if the population is actually recovering, then that one incidentally caught fish per trip might be just fine, and we can keep going that way. So we kind of need more information on that in the first place. But the second part is, figuring out, the fact that they're not getting landed doesn't mean they're not dying. So it kind of needs more of a concerted approach on figuring out whether or not this actually would solve a problem. But first we have to figure out, is there a problem at all? Is this too many fish, or is this just a way where we can start to look at different values on these fish, but not necessarily, doesn't mean that the fishing for them can't happen. Yeah.
Your interest in fish aggregation, spawning actually, seems like a key part of your biology has to be understanding where these aggregations are spawning aggregations. We have some indications that it happens out, maybe afternoon, and you've seen them in groups apart. And those are very good points to where we see them. Please observe it.
Sure. Yeah, so the question is about the importance of spawning aggregations and how that relates to our research findings. I would say that actually the research group at Cal State Northridge has done much more detailed research on spawning behavior and identifying aggregations. They tend to do that at the places where it's easiest to study. So that's usually around Catalina, not so much up here. Very little is known. And then, at certain sites, we are starting to see more and more, and the line between a proper spawning aggregation with courtship and actual spawning occurring, it's not always clearly observed and delineated. So in some cases, we have some of our super user contributors who are saying this is a breeding aggregation, and in other cases, they may be, at least from what we see at the time, mostly just kind of hanging out dispersed throughout the kelp. I am not the right person to answer that. I think they may have or come very, very close and then not captured it at the very last second due to kind of diving conditions. They do. One complicating factor that the question, do they retain spots throughout their lifetime? And there's other researchers who are actually looking at the very initial stages of development with little juvenile giant sea bass in captivity. Guerra in the Pacific actually bred one in captivity and has gotten to watch it throughout its development. They don't actually start with spots, but they gain the spots, and then they're going to move around a little bit because the fish changes shape pretty drastically. And then the other point to make is that these fish can change the kind of background color quite rapidly, so they can get really dark or really light. And in those circumstances, you can't see the spots. There's quite a bit of variation. Not all of them are as clean as we would like them to be. Yeah, in the back.
So, have you ever gotten a set of both sides photos that allows you to go, wow, GSP 85 that we had only left side pictures and GSP 114 that we only had right side pictures are the same fish? And if so, how often does that happen?
We have not. So the question is, have we ever been able to link a left side fish that was previous, or right side, for example, that was previously unlinked to an existing individual ID by gaining a sighting with both sides? And the answer is yes, from both directions. Videos can be quite helpful for that, and then we pull out the screenshots. It doesn't happen as much as we're very excited when that happens. I think it'll happen more and more as we climb up that discovery curve, and it starts. We just start seeing more. We're still in the kind of baseline. Let's get one of each, and then we can start actually seeing matches. I didn't get too far into questions around like seeing them move between different sites. We've gotten a little bit of that, but actually a lot of the matches have been at exactly the same site, like the Casino Point example that I showed you. Let's have a couple new people.
I noticed in one of your photos it looked like the fish was being cleaned. There are a couple little like finger fish. And are there cleaning stations that these fish visit that might be more reliable for picking them up?
Yeah, so to address the question, are there cleaning stations or do these fish get cleaned and are there cleaning stations for them? They absolutely do get cleaned. So juvenile sheephead, absolutely clean them. They get pretty heavy loads of copepods on their faces. I don't know about reliable cleaning stations. How are we doing on time, Andrew? Two more, and then I'm happy to answer questions afterward. Way back in the left.
Thank you. Is there a significant pressure to relax regulations on fishery?
I'll give that to Anna and then give my take as well.
Is there pressure to relax pressure to relax regulations? I'm actually not aware on whether or not there's pressure to relax regulations on this. I don't know how. I do not have enough information to answer your question on this. Yeah, exactly. I think if it was a big contentious issue, I would be more aware. It doesn't, it seems like it's kind of just there.
And for the sake of time, let's actually just jump to the next question. Yeah.
So they're very large carnivores. What species do they eat, and is there any significant impact to those species from such a large fish eating them?
That's a great question. We don't know that much about what they eat. The best way to do that is often looking at gut contents. And by the time these fish are getting to market, the ones that are actually getting harvested, we don't have those anymore. There are researchers in Mexico who are trying really hard to get gut contents. But the rest of the time, actually observing a predation event is tricky because they're generally kind of sit and wait ambush predators, and so you don't, at least to my knowledge, you don't see one kind of poking around hunting. So it would be very kind of surprise incident. And to the second part of your question, I don't think we have studies to really get into those types of impacts.